Hi there. Welcome to a third edition of this little video series idea I've been playing around with that I call What Makes This Pop Song Work. If you've watched any of the other videos, you know I have a band called Fuzzy Math. You can find us on Facebook at Fuzzy Math Jazz or fuzzymath.band on the interweb. But we do original music and then some of what we call creative pop covers. So I spend some time thinking about what makes some songs more interesting than others. And there's obviously lots of things you can talk about on the production side, or even things like great lyrics, a great singing voice, obviously, a beautiful face to go with that voice, all that stuff. But I want to focus on music, and in particular, sort of a bigger picture look at the use of harmony. Because my basic premise here is that I think it's fair to say most pop and rock songs are simpler in terms of harmony than most jazz or classical music. And yet, if you look at them, some songs find ways to clever techniques to create musical interest out of what are otherwise pretty basic chord progressions. And if I have to sum up this idea in two words, it's delayed gratification. So in my last video, I found what I thought were two perfect examples of this, both actually songs by Fleetwood Mac. And so in Dreams, for example, I showed how 99% of the song consists of two chords alternating back and forth, neither one of which is the chord you're looking for, the one chord, the key, the tonic center of the tune. In fact, you only get that chord for one bar in the middle of the instrumental break. But when you get it, it's pretty powerful, pretty satisfying. I think partly also because of the way they used melody to set up this expectation, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. Now, since I did that video, I actually stumbled across another example that's even more extreme in this use of delayed gratification. A song that maybe we don't consider as great, but it was pretty successful, had some lasting appeal. It's Holding Back the Years by Simply Red, where in that case the entire song consists of two chords alternating back and forth, neither one of which is the tonal center of the tune. The chords in that case they're using are a 2-5, and a 2-5-1 is a very common progression, especially actually in traditional jazz. It creates a very strong need for resolving back to the one. So for example, if you're in the key of C, your 2 chord, which is often minor to keep things in the same scale, would be a D minor. Then your 5 would be a G, which wants to go to the 1. Very strong feeling. Now, in that song, like I said, we never actually get the 1. It's just these 2 5s going back and forth. But you probably heard this type of progression a lot, like I said, in traditional jazz. You probably heard of... Now in the Simply Red song, if you remember the song, it's... Or jumping ahead to the chorus. And so on and so on. And that's all we get. They never give us the 1. They kind of just leave us feeling simply red in the face. I know it's a terrible pun. Feel free to stick in your own. But that's basically what they do. Now, I think even they realized that that was a little much. So in the 8-bar intro, they actually stuck in a couple of passing chords in between the 2 and the 5. But otherwise, that was it. Now, just to note that these ideas aren't confined to pop or even to simple settings. An example of extreme delayed gratification on the other end of the spectrum is a song that I think most jazz musicians would acknowledge remains one of the most difficult and complicated to play in the modern jazz repertoire, like if you have to just pick something out of the rule book. And it's John Coltrane's Giant Steps, where there he has lots of chords flying by at breakneck pace, of course, including a lot of 2-5-1s, all outlining 3 different possible tonal centers to the song, each one of which sounds like it could be, the chord the song ends on. And technically how he does this is he divides the octave into symmetric major thirds. So he starts on B, for example, then goes to G, to E flat. So anyway, to bring this back to the world of pop, the song I want to talk about today I think is an example of delayed gratification on a little bit more subtle, little more micro level, but there's a lot of interesting things going on with it. And the song is Fast Car, which has been enjoying a resurgence lately because it was recorded by the country star Luke Combs. And I can only imagine a lot of Gen Zers out there just assume that he wrote it, but of course it goes back to the 80s and the great Tracy Chapman, who had such a distinctive voice and style, which I always appreciate. And in particular, I always thought this song of hers seemed like the most interesting, but I never really dove into it to try to figure out why. So that's what I'm going to try to do now. So the first thing I note about this song is it consists of 4 chords being repeated over and over in the same pattern for almost the whole song. Now the 4-chord block is a staple of rock and pop, maybe for one reason just because simply it's a little more interesting on its face than a 3-chord block, like the 2-5-1s we were looking at before, or their close sibling, the 4-5-1, which is a little more common in pop and rock and kind of a staple of lots of simpler styles of music like folk, bluegrass, older country. So again, if we're in the key of C, the 4-5-1 would be an F major instead of the D minor. To your 5, the G, to your 1. It creates a very strong expectation. It's a very comfortable, familiar sound to us. I think partly because intervals of the 4th, the 5th, and the 1, or the octave, are the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st naturally occurring overtones in the harmonic series. And I know that could be a whole other video, but just trust me on that for now. Incidentally, in the world of jazz, I think the 2-5-1 is more common there because it's grounded in what we call a circle of fifths, which lends itself very easily to modulating to other keys, which is something jazz puts a real premium on. So just a quick example of that. Let's say we're starting this 2-5-1 again, starting on a D, and we'll just make it major for this purpose. To G, to the C, and then you just keep going around this circle of fifths. You move the root down a fifth or equivalently up a fourth from the C to an F, E flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat, and so on. And in 12 steps, you've gone through all 12 keys. Now, what does all this have to do with a fast car? So, obviously, you can turn a 3-chord block into a 4-chord block by adding 1 chord. And it turns out a very natural thing to do is to try to keep this 4-5-1 kind of turnaround together by sticking another chord in between the 1 and the 4, and ideally something that's closely related to both of them. And it turns out a great candidate for this is a minor 6. So if we're in C, the minor 6 is A minor, which is very closely related. It actually is called the relative minor of C, and it only involves changing 1 note. And then again, going from the A minor to an F only involves changing 1 note. And so you have this very natural sounding progression of 1, minor 6, 4, 5. Sounds very familiar to you. In fact, I'm sure it sounds familiar to you because it's... So maybe we'll just call it the heart and soul progression. But you can see how if you're trying to write a new pop or rock song, that doesn't sound particularly hip. Although, you know, somebody like Mark Cohn pulled it off with his Walking to Memphis. So I'm saying there is a chance, but I think you can't go to that well too often. So what a lot of pop and rock songs do is they rearrange things a little bit. And a nice thing you can do that's very simple is instead of ending with a 5 going back to the 1, which again sounds so comfortable to us going back to that overtone series, but it's so common that it's literally called a dominant cadence. Instead, you can go from the 4 back to the 1, which is called a plagal cadence. And I don't even know where that term comes from. You can ping me if you know. But this still sounds pretty final. It's definitely a resolution, just slightly different, slightly less common. But, you know, it's the church amen in all of the hymns. Or even if you just want a churchy sound like the Beatles did in Let It Be, you got 4, 1, 5, 4, 1. So now that we've decided we're going to go from the 4 to the 1, we got to decide what to do with those other 2 chords. And it seems kind of boring to just kind of walk down from the C to the A minor to the G to the F. So we could try flipping those other 2 chords around. So then we're going from the 1 to the 5 to the minor 6 to the 4. And this does a couple things for us. In addition to that plagal cadence, it creates a little up and down motion, which feels kind of good. Then also going to the 5, and then, you know, no matter how hard we try to come up with interesting progressions, every time we hear a 5, our ear just wants to hear it go back to that 1. So instead, going from the 5 to the minor 6, we call that a deceptive cadence, because the minor 6 is so closely related to the 1 Our ear is kind of saying, okay, I see what you're doing there. You're not quite giving me what I want. It's close. So a couple interesting little, what I'll just call, because I'm making up these terms, micro examples of delayed gratification, even within this 4-chord block, which I think is why it turns out this progression has been so massively popular and successful that it's literally a meme. It's kind of funny. You can go out and find a montage somebody did where they stitched together clips from dozens of pretty famous songs that all use this exact same 4-chord progression. And it usually starts on the most famous one, Don't Stop Believing by Journey. 1, 5, 6, 4. And from there, I think it goes to U2's With or Without You. There's literally countless examples. If you want something more recent, because when I'm driving with my girls, I have to have the top 40 station on, I noticed that Louis Capaldi's Someone You Loved uses the exact same progression for everything but the bridge. So again, bringing this back to a fast car, what can these 4 chords do in the brilliant hands of somebody like Tracy Chapman? Well, she takes the same 4 chords, but she rearranges them in this song a little bit more and in a little more interesting way. And I'm going to shift everything that I've been doing from examples in the key of C now to the key of A, because that's the key the song is in. So Ms. Chapman, it turns out, she hits us right off the bat with this plagal cadence. She starts on the 4, the D, and goes to the 1, the A, and then the minor 6, which is the F sharp minor in this case, and then the 5 is an E. Now that's interesting. I would argue that putting the 1 chord, the A, in the second spot of this 4-chord block is the least expected place for it. Now why do I say that? Obviously you can start with the 1, like Heart and Soul or Don't Stop Believing. Obviously you can end with the 1. You know, you could start on the minor 6 and then just do a 4-5-1. Even putting the 1 in the 3rd spot would kind of feel like just a good old 3-chord block, like a 4-5-1, and then you just tag on the 6 at the end to start over and start that cycle again. But getting the 1 in the 2nd spot feels almost to me a little too soon. You weren't quite expecting it that quickly. You're kind of left wondering, okay, what are they going to do now with all this space that's left over? And so I think, again, because I'm just making up these terms, I'm thinking that that's an example of how delayed gratification can mean not just making you wait, but also giving you something a little more quickly than you expected it, and then pulling it back, and then seeing what happens from there. So I find that very interesting. Now you might say, well, Mark, how do we know that this is this plagal cadence of which you speak? You know, why can't we just be in the key of D and we're starting on 1 and going to the 5 and so forth? Good question, because it is true that both D and A and even the F sharp minor could all be consistent with being in the key of D. 2 reasons you're wrong. One is most simply, first of all, by the time we get to the E chord, we've kind of destroyed any feeling that we're in the key of D, at least in a pop context. A reason that's even more interesting, I think, goes back to an idea that I talked about in my last video, which was using melody as a governing factor, which it turns out Fleetwood Mac were masters of. And the idea here is you can use the melody to pretty clearly outline a key, even over some other different chords that feel like they're in the wrong place. It creates it's a very effective technique to make delayed gratification more powerful. So how is that working in this piece? So right off the bat, from the very first beat of the song, Ms. Chapman comes in with this guitar riff that I'm sure you've heard before, kind of these sparse chords. Okay, so what's going on here? Let's look at that top line. Pretty clearly outlining A, even right off the bat over that D chord. If you want more proof, when Miss Chapman comes in to sing, or just to seal the deal, let's look at the chorus. lays there. I'm going to say, I rest my case there. So as long as we're looking at these lines, let's look at what else is going on, because this gets really interesting too. There's 3 lines in these chords, 3 notes in each one that she's playing together. So let's see how that top line we just looked at works with the root notes that we were looking at before. So over the D chord, we have a C sharp. It sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? That's an interval of a major 7th. The only thing that's harsher than that is if we move this C sharp down an octave and we have a minor 2nd. So here's what we have. Now, it can be a beautiful interval. A major 7 chord is a staple of jazz, and it all depends on, I think that's what jazz voicings are all about, is sort of packaging dissonant intervals in a context that sounds better and still adds a little prettiness or almost sadness to it. So this can go to this. Or here's my personal favorite way to voice a major 7 chord, which actually contains every note in what we call a Lydian scale. But she's got these sparse chords going on, so we've got this, which is crying out for some kind of resolution. And do we get it? Sort of. Kind of. We get an A on the bottom and an E on the top. So we'd call that an A, but an open 5th, which is a very kind of fuzzy feeling. Our ear always wants to hear the 3rd. The 3rd tells us whether a chord is major or minor. And just getting the 5th, not wholly satisfying. Maybe we'll get there. Interestingly, actually, that C sharp that we want is sort of still in our ear from the previous chord. But then it's kind of not there. It drops out. It's kind of ghosting us, which is interesting. Very interesting. So then we go to the F sharp with an A on top. It's minor 3rd, so that's fine. And then the E with a G sharp. It's major 3rd, so that's all good. Now there's one more voicing, like I mentioned, and let's see how that's fitting in here. And I think actually this might be the single biggest reason why I've always felt this song was really interesting, but like I said, never bothered to really figure out why. It turns out that middle voicing is a constant A over all 4 chords. So over the D, it's kind of fleshing out that major 7 chord. We still don't have the 3rd, but that's okay. It's not the tonic anyway. Now, is this middle voicing going to help us get some resolution here? Unfortunately not. The middle A is just doubling the root A, and we still have this open 5th relationship for the A. Over the F sharp chord, the middle A just doubles the top A, so not really adding anything, but that's okay. And here's where things really get interesting. That final chord, the E, we have an A and a G sharp. Another major 7 interval. What do you call this? What the heck is going on here? Well, in jazz, there is a very popular type of chord that's called a suspended 4th chord, or a sus4, or sometimes just a sus, we call it, to keep things short. And in traditional jazz, and it's also pretty common in pop actually, you would tend to use this as sort of its own little micro example of delay. You would voice, say, a 5 chord typically is how this is used, with the 4 maybe on top, and then that would resolve to a regular 5 chord from the 4 to the 3 before going to a 1, whatever version you want. It can also just not resolve, but once your ear gets used to these sus chords, as we call them, it's sort of implied. You could just go straight from to a really nice, pretty major 7 chord on the A. But in general, that's how it tends to be used. Now, I know Herbie Hancock came along and he showed us that sus chords can function just fine on their own. They don't have to be 5 chords. That was the point of Maiden Voyage. He also showed us, course, that in hands as skilled as his, you can voice any chord just about however you want to. But in a pop setting, I think it's pretty fair to say that what I just described is pretty accurate. You don't hear over a 5 chord the 3rd and the 4th at the same time. But that's what she's giving us. Now, she does kind of make it sound a little more natural, interestingly, because again, we've heard this A on all the chords. So we've had... So it sounds a little more natural there, but she's really got us on edge here. It's super interesting. It's kind of brilliant. So that's the verse. That repeats a couple more times. We've got this droning, we've got this longing going on, which is what the song is about. And then we get to the chorus, and a couple things happen in the chorus. So I'm just going to play it for you first. So I remember when we
voice and your arms are the nice wrap around my shoulder. And I had a feeling that I belonged. I had a feeling I could be someone, be someone, be someone.
And we're back to the riff going on and on again. So a couple big things happen in the chorus that were pretty powerful. First thing you might have noticed, the first half of the chorus is the same 4 chords in the same order, but she's doubled their length. Instead of a half a bar each, they're getting a full bar each, which feels kind of nice. We feel like we're getting a chance to breathe. So that's one thing. But maybe more importantly, we're finally getting full chords, full strums on that guitar, which we've been waiting so long for. So a full D, and then even more importantly, hallelujah, a full A with the third and everything. It feels so good when we finally get there. And of course, this is the happy part of the song where she's reminiscing about driving fast and feeling like a real person and belonging and all that. So that feels great. And then a full minor 6. And she does that. That's the first half of the bridge. And then the second half, of course, we can't ever be left fully satisfied. She changes things up a little bit. She breaks the pattern, which is actually nice. But she goes from we're back to half bar chords. She goes from the D, instead of down to the A, up to the relative minor, the F sharp, and then a full bar on E. And then she does it again, D to the F sharp, sits on the E. And then for one last twist, she gives us a little tag at the end, a little turnaround. Goes back down to the D for half a bar, and back up to the E for half a bar. And for the first time, we're getting a D to an E, and we're thinking, oh my gosh, are we going to get just a good old 4-5-1? But of course, no, we're back to these sparse, kind of sad voicings. We get another verse or two, we get another chorus, just like I described, and then she ends the song back on this sparse, kind of lonely riff. A slight retard and a plagal cadence to an A with an open fifth, and that's how she leaves us hanging. Beautiful, brilliant, perfect. I'm not going to say anything more about it. That's my take on Fast Car. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you did. Let me know if there's another song that you'd like to hear me talk about. And otherwise, have a good week, be safe, and of course, drive safe. Thanks.